Welcome to the Collective Regional Summit presented by Community Trust Bank. This event is an opportunity for all of us to come together and take the next big step to improving collaboration on key issues that will help advance the Bluegrass region's economy. Over the next 3 days, more than 250 regional business and community leaders throughout our nine-county economic development region will be convening to explore common challenges and shared issue priorities. The Regional Summit is aimed at building on our current regional collaboratives, including efforts in leadership development through Leadership Central Kentucky, economic development through the Bluegrass Alliance, and public policy advocacy through the Central Kentucky Policy Group. Some of the most successful cities and regions across the country have one thing in common: strong regional partnerships and shared economic growth goals that drive businesses and community leaders in a common direction. The COVID-19 pandemic has reinforced the need for regional economic growth goals and strategies to ensure the Bluegrass region is able to compete for jobs, talent, and other resources. We need each other for workforce, for land, for housing, and infrastructure investment. We have more in common than divides us. So let's get started with the first ever Regional Summit. Now, I'd like to thank all our sponsors of the Regional Summit for their support of this event. We appreciate their recognition of the value of greater regional collaboration to our economy. I'd like to recognize Larry Jones, Central Region President of Community Trust Bank, for presenting sponsor remarks. Larry.
Delighted to be here. Our company is extremely pleased to be the presenting sponsor for this event. You just know that this geography has all kinds of potential for future growth, and we need to bring us all together to learn what we can glean from each other and then grow to be successful. And Bob, thanks for the opportunity to be the presenting sponsor, Community Trust Bank.
Thank you, Larry, and you've been a great partner to work with, and we appreciate your bank's investment in the region and in making this one of the best places in the world to live, to work, and to raise a family. And now I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker. We have a very special guest with us to kick off the summit. Ted Abernathy is a well-respected economic development practitioner with more than 35 years of experience in the field. Ted is the managing partner of Economic Leadership, LLC, and is currently working in more than a dozen states to development for economic development and workforce strategies. Ted may be a familiar face to some attendees who participated in Commerce Lexington's leadership visit to Raleigh, North Carolina a couple years ago. Ted joins us during this event to provide thought-provoking insights about the power of shared economic goals to economic advancement. We asked Ted to set the stage for us about economic growth trends, how our region stacks up against other cities based on data points, and insight about strategies to enhance our competitiveness, referring to business climate, infrastructure, and talent. Joining us from his home in North Carolina, Ted Abernathy, please proceed with your presentation. Glad to have you.
Bob, it's nice to be with everybody today, and I hope you can see the screen. Everything's working well. It's an interesting time to be talking about our future. We have had a 2020 that I don't think anybody ever expected to have something like this. And so as we think about the region and our economic future, we're thinking about a reset as we go into 2021. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about the things that we ought to be getting ready for, things that are the residue of the world we've been living through in 2020. So first, just to put you in position, we came into this year, New Year's Eve this year, with a lot of high hopes. The economy had slowed down a little last year, but it was still strong. We were at full employment, near record low unemployment. Consumer confidence was high. The household savings rate were about double what they were 10 years ago. Healthy housing and real estate markets, and very, very low interest rates. So we were feeling pretty good. Kentucky's job numbers had not been quite as good since the coming out of the Great Recession. You're the red line along here. You were a little bit lower than the national average. And then over the last 5 years, you can see in the state which areas were growing fast and which were not growing. Luckily for you guys, almost all of the counties in your region were growing, some above the state average. But there were parts of Kentucky that, despite 10 years of growth nationally, weren't growing at all. One good thing and one very different thing about what was going on in Kentucky and what was going on in your region was that manufacturing had made a comeback. We'd lost about 100,000 jobs from the late 90s through the deep recession, but coming out of that, quite a few jobs have been added back, and it's a big part of what's going on within your region. Nationally, when you look at GDP, again, Kentucky a little less than the national average through the last group of years coming out of the recession, but closing that gap in the last few years and almost at the national average last year. But then the world changed. And I don't think that anybody listening today probably is living the exact life or running the exact business they ran 8 months ago. If you think about what it is that drives business and what it is that makes business concerned, business risk is the key. It's in the center of things. And so businesses today are navigating a global pandemic that's impacted all their businesses, that triggered a global recession. And not just us, but around the world recession. We lived in a year in 2020 with politics that we knew would happen. Every 4 years we have elections like this, and it creates risk. And then over the summer, and in Kentucky also, some civil unrest that added more risk to what we were doing. So businesses aren't just dealing with a pandemic and its fallout, they're dealing with other things that increase business risk. And so that makes them nervous, makes business look for opportunities, but it also makes them hedge what they're going forward with. So I do a lot of charts, and I've been doing charts for a long time, and people say, well, will we always remember 2020? And the answer is you'll never be able to forget it if you see a chart. This is the 113 straight months of employment growth, private sector employment growth, all the way back to 2010. It's all those little blue dots along the way. And then what happened to us in March and April of this year. So we lost, and lost is an interesting word. We'll talk about it. We lost 22 million jobs during that period of time. Nobody knew how many of them were permanent versus how many of them were temporary because of closed downs. But 22 million jobs, this is to scale, and it shows you what we've got. Since then, over the last 7 months, we've been adding jobs back. And they've been decelerating since June. And you may have heard last week that November numbers came out. And with the second surge in the pandemic, they were a little bit smaller, still gaining jobs, but we're about 55.5% of the way back. And the question for everyone is how many of the jobs left that we lost are permanent losses versus temporary losses that'll come back when things get back to whatever the next new normal happens to be. When you look at your region, a couple things pop out. So the U.S. is the darkest bars here, Kentucky in the Kentucky blue, and Lexington in the bright chartreuse that stands out. And you can see that your economy locally reacted a little bit differently than the national economy. If you look at Kentucky's construction number, it's actually up overall, while both the nation and your region are down. That 4.4% is a loss in construction. But a couple things stood out to me. One is that your education and health services number is considerably greater losses than the nation. And this doesn't take into account that that you have a strong part of that. It just means that you've lost 8%. Nationally, we're between 150 and 200,000 less higher education jobs than we had a year ago. So higher education's taken a big hit in all of this. The other is on the positive side. Nationally, if you look at the dark bars, leisure and hospitality has been the big loser. And this is both leisure and hospitality of tourists, but also your and my leisure and hospitality, going out to dinner, going to the movies, going to the theater. Your area is in all the areas I look at, yours area has been hit about the lowest. So I don't know exactly what's going on, but overall, your leisure and hospitality industry has not been impacted as bad as we've had nationally. Thinking forward, and if you're thinking forward as a region, the question is, what's next? What's post-pandemic new normal? And we're going to talk about a bunch of things, but we're going to talk about 4 specific today. And those 4 things start with the concept of remoteness. Everything about this pandemic makes us think forward about what's remote. Remote's going to rule because we have been in training now for 7, 8 months. We're going to be in training for another half year, most of us, and we're going to learn to do everything we can remotely. So you think about that, the biggest one everybody talks about is remote work. About 3/4 of people who have been sent home to work or sent somewhere to work remotely, about 3/4 say they like doing it, at least part of the time. When you talk to companies, they're thinking that at least 30% of the workforce is going to be doing remote work over the next 3 to 5 years. And that's a lot of people all of a sudden, not in our downtowns, not out at our company sites, a lot of people remote working. Now, there's an argument going on. A bunch of CEOs say that they'll need less office space. But the question is, do you really want people back in the offices? About 40% of the CEOs surveyed said that remote work was increasing their productivity. On the other side, 31% said that it was decreasing their productivity. And we don't have enough data yet to know if that's because of the type of company or the culture of the company or just the way it's done. But overall, we're looking at people wanting to work more remotely, some CEOs thinking that it helps their productivity, and a whole bunch saying that it's a good way to save on their office cost. So my guess is that you're going to see a significant number of people remote working from their homes. That's going to change the physical layout of our places, but it's also going to change our demands for what we want from our residents. And then the whole idea of working from home is going to change business travel. I'm doing this today, and this is, I think, close to 100 of these I've done this year. Last year, I was on planes over 120 days. This year, I haven't been on a plane since March. That changed. So work travel represents about 20% of overall travel on the globe. And Delta, the CEO of Delta has said he thinks the new normal is 20% or more of business travel will be gone forever. So we're changing that. Well, that'll change hotels, that'll change business, eating restaurants. It changes a lot of things as we go forward. But it's not just work. Remote healthcare. Many of you have been out there talking to your doctor online. Before this all happened, we talked about this, but most insurance companies didn't cover it, and we just didn't do it. And now it's become normal, and everybody seems to think that at least partially doing some healthcare online makes sense. Remote entertainment, remote banking, remote exercise, remote shopping, all of that's there. We're currently doing remote dating, and I'm pretty sure that's one of the trends that isn't going to last. I don't think that that's a permanent solution to the dating issue, but tele-entertainment and how we do that is here to stay. And I'm sure every one of you is talking to your favorite, either Amazon or somebody else today, doing your Christmas shopping. You've been in training, you're doing things you never thought you'd do before. And for most people, it's now one of those tricks they've learned, and it's going to be here. Second thing to talk about, and one that will impact your region either positively or negatively, is the concept of relocations. Around the country, everybody's trying to figure out where are people moving to because of COVID. Now, the question becomes, are people going to be wanting to stay in multifamily and more dense areas, or is the next step a single family in a more remote area? Now, some of this we think we know because we've looked at Zillow and looked at how many places people have looked at, but looking at houses and searching for houses is not the same thing as picking up and moving. About 3 times as many people will probably move in 2020 as moved in 2019, but people have been moving for a while. And if you look at domestic migration over the last decade, they've been moving out of New York and Chicago and Seattle and San Francisco all those times already. They were moving out. International newcomers were moving in, keeping those numbers pretty steady. But those big cities were already having people move out, mostly because of affordability. They weren't all moving to the country though, because places under 100,000 were losing even more people faster. So the places that were winning were the metros in the middle, the 100,000 to million metros. And so do I think that we're going to see those metros continue to be strong coming out of this? Yes. And places like the Lexington Metro have a real opportunity to attract people. But they're going to attract people based on having the right mix. You're going to need to have high-speed internet. You're going to have transportation networks that work. You're going to have the lifestyle with delivery and online shopping and all those things that work. And you're still going to need to have an airport and those things for people when they make those decisions. So are the strongest mid-size going to be the big winners? That would be my guess. And the question for you guys is, are you as strong as you can be? This gets to be a problem long-term because one of the overwhelming demographic shifts in America is our declining growth in our labor pool. We've not had a year where we've grown by more than 0.5% in 2 decades. Overall, our prime working age growth has been slowing pretty dramatically since the 70s. And what that means is that more and more workforce becomes the issue and talent becomes the issue. It isn't getting any better. Birth rates are at all-time lows the last few years, and there's no doubt in my mind that 2020 is going to be the lowest year that we've recorded in decades. So for the long term, the ability to have workforce and talent becomes the most important thing for a local community. Now, Kentucky's change in population for the last 5 years shows that almost all the counties in your region were growing. And in fact, they were growing faster than the Kentucky average. But these are charts that if you know your states, you know well that in the eastern part of Kentucky and the far west, there are counties that are losing population. As you think about losing that population, you're going to have to be able to attract talent in order to have the businesses want to be there. And if you look at the projections going forward around the country, it's an interesting map because everybody in the Midwest and Northeast is projected to have their working age population slow down. And that includes Kentucky, although not as much as some of the other places. The only places growing working age population are the eastern seaboard of the South, Texas, and a lot of people in the West. Again, this is just overall population growth of working age. If you look at your population overall, this isn't working age, but overall population, you're still expected to grow. And maintaining the quality of life, cost of living balance in order to attract people is going to be a key. Third thing is the idea of workforce and robots. So if I went out and asked, and we're actually doing this now for a couple clients, talking to employers about what your workforce needs are going to be in 2021 and beyond, by and large, people tell us they have no idea. They don't know what the outcomes are going to be from the pandemic. They don't know what consumer changes are going to be. They don't know what occupational shifts are going to be. They're trying to figure it out on the fly because so much is changing as we move. So I think what you're going to see is a lot more temporary workforce. You're going to see more gig economy, more part-time, more on-demand. This isn't new. Big companies like IBM in the 80s and 90s had a temporary staff. Sometimes up to 20% of their staff would be temporary on demand. And I think you're going to see more of that because at least in the short run, people do not know what the next thing is around the corner. The other thing though that you're going to see is a huge focus on robotics and automation. Robots don't stay home during a pandemic. They're not curtailed. And so we knew that manufacturers and to some extent construction companies were heavy robotics over the last decade or two. What you're going to see now is a whole lot more in the service industries, in the healthcare industry, and the retail industry. People are going to try to automate as quick as you can. That's going to create a lot of new manufacturing and programming for robots, but a lot of robotics are going to be there. It's going to mean you're going to need to retrain more people, short-term retraining of people with skills that have become obsolete. So that automation is an area that will impact all of us. And Kentucky is not one of the states most impacted. You can see the Deep South and the Upper West. Lower in manufacturing and services in mining and farming are the big keys, but it's an area to keep in mind. The last thing is just a general reset of everything. If you think about first all of our small businesses, we're going to see a churn because small business revenue is down about 20%. So you're going to expect to lose somewhere between 20 and 40% of all the small businesses that started 2020 probably won't finish 2021. I know that sounds harsh. You were going to lose a churn in small business based on a normal churn, but now you're going to lose a lot of those that are there because they've not been able to maintain their customer base or their support. What you will see, though, is a lot of new businesses because money is cheap right now. Loans are low. People have been saving more. If I showed you a savings rate, they're saving about 15%. And people who are home and figuring out that they can work independently are going to think more about working independently for themselves. So I would expect a real churn in small business. You're going to see also a churn in geoeconomics. We knew that after the last recession in 2007 and 8, that globalization slowed pretty dramatically. We're going to expect to see that again. More slowdown happening as we go forward. And we set a record last month for the highest negative trade balance that we had. And so I think that we're going to be recalibrating our global work right now. And if you think about reshoring, we've talked about that a lot. There are going to be opportunities for biopharmaceuticals, medical devices, anything related to defense, anything related to food, because we figured out that it's better to have things inside our borders in times of crisis than be dependent on people all over the world. The other parts of the daily reset includes just our general lives. Higher education, K-12, healthcare, and our governments have all been impacted, and they're all going to have to make adjustments over the next couple of years. Government revenues will be down. Healthcare has been strained. Everybody I talk to in K-12 basically says that this has been a really almost lost year for kids, as a lot of places around the country in and out and stops and starts, and it's very different. And then higher education, important to your region, has been hit really hard. Everything from sporting events to kids not being in dormitories to donors not donating as much, eventually probably to state governments not providing as much support to the public universities. We're going to have to reset what we think is the norm for many of the things that are part of our daily lives. So I want to give you 3 things to think about as we go forward. One is rising competition. And as Bob said when we went into this, it's important to try to figure out where you stand in that. So the top site selection issues for 2020 are listed there on the left. This is from the annual survey that went out, and quite honestly, every year workforce, business climate, and infrastructure are in some way or another the top 3 things we look at. Highway accessibility is important. I know you have interstates and other things that really help your area, but the availability of skilled labor costs, and the quality of life that attracts labor are the next 3. And then there's a lot of things that around cost, around corporate tax rate, tax exemptions. What that means is that you actually, your competitiveness is made up of a lot of factors. Some are state factors. When someone's looking at whether they want to invest in your area or if they're a person deciding whether to move there, some of it has to do with things that are at the state level. A bunch of things happen at the metro level or regional level. And then finally, there are factors that are important at the county or city level. So when you're thinking about your metro, and a few of these were mentioned at the beginning, I mean, labor and talent is a metro, it's the #1 issue, and it's always a metro issue because people move across lines without worrying about that. Highways and infrastructure like airports are always regional. Quality of life is regional. The things you like doing are located in different parts of the region. The proximity and the supply chains to your suppliers, if you're a business, or to your customers, they're regional. Energy is a regional thing. Housing, we don't think about housing very often as regional because we're doing our planning and zoning at the local level. But housing affordability is different in each of your counties. And as people travel across the region for work, their labor markets and their housing markets are tied together. So in my home county of Wake County, where Raleigh is in North Carolina, our housing prices are high. But just to the east of us, Johnston County's housing prices are much more reasonable. 40% of the people that get up every morning in Johnston County drive straight into Wake County. So it becomes a regional housing market. and your brand is regional. I know that it's easy to think that a lot of times you have a county brand or a city brand, but if you ask people around the country or just companies looking, they don't know many county names. They might know a few city names, but what they basically know is the big metro name, and that's what they're thinking about. This is just an example on the labor market. This is the University of Kentucky, and this is their home counties. You can see that there are people who work at the University of Kentucky in almost every county around the state. And if you look at your metro area, hundreds of people in every county travel every day into Lexington and into the university. We could do this with every one of your major employers. So when you start thinking about the most important thing to business is labor, labor is always going to be regional, and therefore it's going to be regional for you to deal with. The first rule of understanding competitiveness, and I do not mean to be trite about this, we've been telling people this for 10 years. First rule is don't drink your own Kool-Aid. I cannot tell you how many places I go where we're assessing their competitiveness and they want to tell me things that just aren't what I would get from the data. You know that you're going to have some local things that really matter. But the second thing is that data analytics are now ruling the world, the talent world. We know more about things than about places than we've ever known before. So this is a chart we do every year. It ranks all the people who tell you whether you're the best state to do this, that, or the other thing in Forbes and CNBC and Chief Executive. And we plot it against the actual performance economically of job growth and wage growth and growth in GDP. And what you can see is down in the lower left are the states that everybody ranks high and whose performance is high. What you see in the upper right, where Kentucky is, are places that are ranked fairly low and average about 40. And your overall, that's the best state rankings are in the, I think, 37 are for you guys. Your overall performance is 40. That's not a criticism of you, it's what people see at the state level. But we can also look at other things. This is I know it's a horrible looking chart, but for manufacturing groups every year, we do analysis of over 50 data points to rank the states best in manufacturing. Kentucky's in the upper half of that. Utah's number 1, Texas number 2 right now. But people are looking at data points to analyze what works and what doesn't work. This is GDP per capita and mapped against the growth in GDP. And I'll tell you why it matters in a minute. But if you look at states where the GDP per capita is high and it's growing faster than the national average, they're up there in the right. That's California and Washington and Massachusetts. You might think, wait a minute, I didn't think that those were the states that were doing well in business, but they are growing their economy faster than other places. You can see that most places, it's disproportionate. So most are down in the bottom corner. And so people are looking at what the output is. The reason that matters is we can also map some of that with GDP per capita for metros. This is all the metros in the top 140 metros in the country. You can see that Lexington actually does pretty good. You're at the national average overall in GDP per capita, but your GDP is slowing slightly. And that's something that you ought to pay attention to with when you're looking at your strategies. You can see over on the right, more technology companies, more big companies up in the top quartile, but other places dropping. And if you're a place like Provo, Utah, and they're one of the ones we pull out because people don't think about Provo, Utah very often, their growth has been about as fast as anybody's in recent years. They had a long way to go, but they've come out of that. Reason we care about things like that is that GDP per capita is correlated almost exactly with income. And so when you look at incomes and what people are making, even adjusted for local cost of living, you end up with this GDP per capita that matches what personal incomes is. Now, I know I'm throwing a lot of data at you, but this is what site selectors and more what people are able to look at. You can also use the data to make yourself feel a little bit better. So we think one of the opportunities coming out of the economic crisis we're currently in is that we'll spend more money on advanced healthcare and pharmaceuticals. If you look at growth in the leading stage for advanced industry growth and healthcare growth over the last few years, Kentucky's done really well. I don't know if anybody pays much attention to that, but you're up among the top states for healthcare and advanced healthcare jobs over the last few years. And this is just a look. We did this for 30 metros for a client, and I reran the numbers for Lexington. And if you think that, I don't know how many people would get that you're doing much better than Philadelphia, or better than Charlotte, or better than Indianapolis, or Dallas, Texas, Durham, North Carolina, which is known as Health City. I mean, that's what they call themselves. So looking at the data allows you to see what people who are evaluating you look for. And then the other thing that I think is a strong one is that talent. If you map the number of people with a BA and the people that are outside of the state of Kentucky that moved there, Lexington's in that upper quartile again, up there with Provo and Salt Lake City, and not far below Austin. As you can see, most of the cities are above the line, which means that more talented, more educated people are moving mostly to cities. So if we mapped every county by urbanness or ruralness, you would see most of the rural counties below that line. And so that's the highly educated. Again, if you're a certain type of business, you want to be able to see that. Then the third thing and last thing is that this idea of regionalism isn't new to anybody, but successful collective leadership, I think, is the new place differentiator for communities. Places that do this well are the places who are doing better. I got so frustrated a few years ago, we ended up creating a company that measured how people collaborate. And the reason for putting this up is to show that the collaboration is about strategy, but it's also about, can you get things done? Can you work together? Can you deal with all of this overwhelming information, ambiguity, and conflict that you end up with? And communities are getting better and better at it. And as they do that, it gives them a competitive advantage against places that don't. There's a collaboration continuum. First, at the middle is nobody does anything. And there are places around the country where at a regional level, nothing works. But there are places that, individual cities and counties are doing things. You move up, you get coordination between the cities and counties. And then eventually you get a collective impact, which is the Stanford model of synergies. The more you work on the same things together, the more that you can impact those. And I want to be Pollyanna. There are places that are, working against each other and having negative impacts. And in some communities, and you can probably name a few, they just work against each other and nobody wants to be there. And it is not reasonable to think that every place is going to do better. We can name regions around the country that have been on the way down now for 25 years. And in a lot of cases, their lack of coordination is part of that. So as we go forward and reset, this is what we're thinking about. These are the kind of things that are out there. Collaboration with data, with a clear focus going forward, and recognize that you're in this with a lot of other people. So Bob, I'll stop there, stop sharing my screen, and maybe you and I can have a chat for a few minutes.
Let's do that. Thank you, Ted. A lot of incredible information to try to digest here. And some of my questions, Ted, they're going to probably be a little duplicative of things you said, but maybe you can kind of help us focus in a little bit more. You showed the site selection chart of all those different factors that impact. So that gave us a really good idea about what other cities and regions are doing. I mean, right there is the playlist. Is in your research and looking at Central Kentucky, did you find a couple communities that kind of stood out that kind of match up to us where we can try to emulate them? Or I know that's got to be the $1 million question you get from everybody. It's like, give me the playbook, But are there people out there that we could learn a thing or two from that we have something more in common with?
So I think that the trick is learning from people over time. Back in the 80s and 90s, the Atlanta Metro jumped ahead of a whole lot of people. And they did so. They were the first people who sort of got into the regionalism. I think the Olympics helped them sort of focus themselves. But they got into regionalism, and they had regional economic development in a war room and all of that. But over time, Salt Lake City and Provo and Utah led the way by figuring out what their strategy ought to be. Y'all came to the Research Triangle. We did our first strategy in 2001. And the key to it was two things. It was making sure people knew what to do, But it was also about understanding what we could do, what we were good at, and what we did. There were things that we thought we might be good at that we weren't very good at. So I think that area does a good job. Nashville does a good job. Uh, you've been to some places. You know that Chattanooga got a real clear vision at one point, and we're able to do that. Sioux Falls, South Dakota has done that. Kansas City has figured out that they have an entrepreneurial streak in them, and they're able to do that. So I think that what I would look at are the people who has been successful, and what it is their structures look like. But in all cases, their structures look like people having a clear vision and everybody pitching in and doing the part that they do best.
Yeah, and I'm going to say that you hit right on so many of the questions that we had put together, very effective. And what you just touched on, for 80 years, we've done leadership trips, and we've gone and we've benchmarked ourselves, sometimes against bigger cities, bigger regions, because quite frankly, they had something that they were doing that we were trying to model on a different scale, but that we were trying to put together. This next year, we're going to Austin. We were going to do it this year. This will be our third time there. There's just a lot of things that they're doing that just kind of match with us, but also are a little bit forward thinking. So that'll be our next step, hopefully now in 2021 with the pandemic behind us. But if you were in our shoes, what would be that next thing that you would do coming out of these kind of discussions? Realizing our leadership programs have been going on since 1999 and have really brought people together. Our economic development's been going together, working together, the ED consultants, or the ED practitioners and the utility folks for 35 years. And probably the newer thing that we've been doing since 2005 is the public policy advocacy focus. But going forward, what would you do if you were in our shoes as far as taking that next step to come out of here? So we're having a lot of dialogue, but what would, in your mind, would be a clear next step?
The two things that people are doing today, and I know you're doing the first one well now, you're on your way, is really understanding talent and talent attraction to the area. There are not high growth areas in the country right now who are growing all the talent that they need. They're having to attract it in. And that doesn't just mean, people with PhDs or people with college degrees. They're attracting in people who have manufacturing backgrounds, who have construction. I mean, that middle set of skilled jobs. So understanding what your job needs are going to be at a granular level and having the type of talent apparatus that will retrain them once they're there. Because once you create a stickiness where they're going to be there, you're trying to get them to come, but you don't want them to be migrant workers. You want to try to attract them. So the talent side would be one. The second would be probably trying to understand at a granular level more of the data specifically for your companies that are there. If you have some anchors that are really strong, looking at their supply chains and being really close to them as they're changing, because some of them are changing their supply chains as we speak. And that it's not as easy as sort of the soundbite of let's just all move everything from China back to the US. That's not what will happen. What will happen is people will be, they'll look at Canada, they'll look at Mexico, they'll look at other places. They'll change their supply chains, but their supply chains are still in flux. And so I would look closely and how what you could do could help them be more profitable in what they do. So overall supply chains, labor, and then being the best you can be at the data analytics so that anytime you're in a game against somebody else, you know what their strengths and weaknesses are and your strengths and weaknesses.
I know one of the focuses of our efforts at Commerce Lexington, the city, out in the region, has been technology and how we further develop and grow that economy. A lot of people have seen some of those rankings that have Kentucky or Lexington, probably more in the region, a little bit higher up. But that seemed to be an area in your research that you found that we're struggling at a little bit. And so what would be the things there that we would need to kind of get our hands around to grow? Because we have the University of Kentucky here and some really high-end private sector businesses and industries, and we're grappling to get our hands around that portion of our economy.
You're blessed with some assets, but I think Kentucky's overall technology numbers are down. They're declining, and they're in the bottom third of the states. So two things about technology. First, you can measure tech companies, and I think there's about 87 NAICS codes that you add up to get to the technology companies that are in core IT, which is hardware, software, and communication, that are in life sciences, that are in environmental tech, and that are in energy tech. You can measure all of that, and that gives you one set of numbers. And that's the numbers I've seen that show that you're sliding, that you're actually net losing jobs. On the other side, there's technology occupations. So if someone is a technologist working at Toyota, then they're listed in manufacturing, and they're listed in auto manufacturing. They're not listed in technology. So I would look at both my tech industries, but also my tech occupations, because they're not the same thing, and try to figure out what's really needed to strengthen the areas that you are growing in from a technology standpoint, and then try to match up my university and community college assets with the technologies that are needed by our core companies. You're still going to need those anchor companies. And then past that, you're going to want to try to create an entrepreneurial atmosphere that allows, for the person who leaves one of those companies or comes out of that university to start that next company that is, maybe a competitor, but also maybe part of the supply chain. So I would look at both the industry and the occupations. And then I would spend a great deal of time deconstructing what is actually needed by companies of people who have technology, and make sure that matches what's being taught to students. Today, technology is moving pretty quickly, and it's not the day when I went to school and typed up Fortran cards. Doesn't do you much good anymore. Maybe the federal government's still using that, but I don't think anybody else is. And I think today what you're looking at is the ability to use and adapt quickly. And so try to make sure that University of Kentucky and everybody else is teaching what companies are going to be needing going forward.
Another thing that we're very fortunate in the leadership of our community put together internet, high-speed internet, and expanded out the availability in our community and region. We've learned through the work at home how many people, including kids, so it's all ages, have come to rely upon that. But there's still a divide between rural and urban in that of getting that next step out into the rural areas. Our horse farms are big manufacturing facilities. I don't want to belittle the industry; it's huge, but that's billions of dollars to us. Tourism and all that, just all the marketing, all those pieces go together. So, again, what do you see down the road from where we're at today that we're going to have to attain or reach out to become?
So your horse farms, like all agriculture, is also dependent on tech. I've told this story a couple times. I apologize if I've told it to you, but probably about 18 months ago, I was in the Midwest doing a big event for 500 farmers, 500 agricultural people in the audience. And after about 10 minutes, I asked everybody to raise their hand if in the 10 minutes I had been talking, they had been operating equipment from their phone while they were listening to me, or maybe not listening to me. And almost everybody in the room stood up and said they had. So technology today it permeates everything we do. It does permeate our lives, our schooling, but all our businesses, whether those businesses are horse farms or whether they're major manufacturers or whether they're software companies. And so I wish that it wasn't true that high-speed internet is now the utility that we need it to be. But some people in your audience probably recognize that back in the 30s and 40s, we were extending electricity, and everybody didn't think we needed electricity, or everybody didn't think we needed water and sewer. And nowadays, it is just part of our life. So it is uneven around the country. It's uneven even within cities. In your metro areas, you have some areas that are different. There's a lot of changes going on with technology, and some people believe that we are going to innovate our way out of needing specifically what we need, we think we need right now. But high-speed internet is, the requirements are getting higher and higher. spoke to a group this week in North Carolina. In 2000, they did a rural study on what the most important things for rural promotion was in the state. In 2000, it was internet. Now, it was 25 at that time, and today it's a lot higher, but we've known for a long time that it was part of what it takes to be competitive, and now what it takes to live your life. So more and more, we're going to have to figure out ways either to deliver what we know we need now or to find innovations that get us around that, whether that's 5G towers everywhere or low satellites or whatever. And you're out of my league on that. But somewhere, if you expect a community to be able to compete, it's going to have high-speed internet.
The other thing I hear a lot about these days, people kind of throwing out that dream of having different modes of transportation, whether it be a tram or expanded bus service to get from all different parts of town. Do you see that with the people that might be moving from some of these bigger metro areas moving in? And do you also see that need in communities to have a better transportation mode system in place?
Yeah, flexible mobility is the way I would put it. And flexible mobility can be anything from a really well-designed van line and or point-to-point Uber, or that there are lots of ways to do mobility. I think that you're going to see a little bit of a slowdown in traditional mass transit post-pandemic because they've been hit pretty hard with people staying out of mass transit right now. But there's no doubt that we're going to see more live, work, play communities where you're going to have less need to travel except by walking or bicycle. That's what millennials and Zs want. And I think the places that are going to be successful are going to be able to figure out that. We're already seeing the redesign of first ring suburbia to try to match that. And so people are going to have mobility to places. Maybe we're going to cut down permanently some of our mobility based on remote stuff that I talked about, but I think you're still going to have that in order to appeal to people. And companies are still, you've got companies sort of scattered in your region. They're out in a little bit, and being able to tighten some of that up and to be able to build housing that fits the ones that are scattered are both going to be important as you mature and densify as a region. So I think you ought to be looking at all of those things. That puts a lot of pressure. I actually think that what's happening with the pandemic puts a great deal of pressure on our planners and on our city officials to respond to changes that are not what we expected. And and that's everything from auxiliary buildings to people working from home. I mean, there are a lot of things about the way we thought about planning 20 years ago that don't look like what they'll look like coming out post-pandemic. And some places are going to react quick to that. Some places are going to fight against it, and the places that fight against it are probably going to get left a little bit behind because the consumer market will determine what happens. And right now, people want to be able to access things and live based on some new rules. So I think we're all going to be in for a little bit of a post-pandemic training session on how the world is, but we've been doing it now for the last year, so I think we're probably ready for it.
We're starting to get used to it. Another question that came, go ahead.
I'm good.
Let's just say another question we got from an audience member was, in most other markets that you're in where you have projects going on where you're trying to help the community of the region, who typically convenes those meetings? Those meetings? Is it led by a Chamber of Commerce, an economic development group? Is it public sector? Is it government? Is it a mix? What do you find in those areas? What tends to work a little bit better, or does it vary by the community and the region?
So it does vary. It depends on sort of the personality of the region. But what we're seeing more and more is either business-led policy groups or public-private partnerships. And the reason is that the business community in many cases is more stable long-term than the elected official community. You've got a lot of places in the country now that have rules on how long, but you also have quite a bit of turnover. And some of this stuff, we're doing work in Missouri. The Kansas City airport is going to take 15 years to do. Dealing with the local mayor or the city council, most of those people will turn over in that period of time. So you're seeing more private sector leadership in. I think you're also seeing a lot more of the nonprofit business sector. So chambers of commerce are in there, or public policy groups, or CEO leadership groups, or others. Overall, you're looking, the best thing you're looking for is a regional steward, someone who is interested in the place. And this sort of place-based caring or stewardship is the key for long term. And there are things that everybody ought to be doing. We ought to be educating. We ought to be all those things that are important to the people in our community. But somebody has to take hold of the place-based stewardship. And place-based, again, is around all that infrastructure that's there, the overall business climate, whether it's regulatory or legal or tax. Those kind of things are things that people sort you out of based on data. And if you're not in the game there, you can't compete. So I'm seeing that that a lot of it's driven by the private sector, and there's a big but, a lot of the things that are needed are public sector things. So whether that's safety or whether that's education or whatever it happens to be. So this isn't one of those things where a private sector can just stand back and say, hey, y'all do this. It doesn't work that way. So driven by, steward by some group of public and private. And within the different parts of the country, different groups have risen to be, whether they're, I was talking about Kansas City a minute ago, their civic council's been around for 100 years. Their civic council tends to drive the really hard things to get done. In the Triangle, and where y'all were, the Raleigh Chamber and the Durham Chamber meet regularly, and together they do a lot of this, along with the Research Triangle Regional Partnership. In upstate South Carolina and Greensboro-Spartanburg, it's the Upstate Alliance. So some group that has demonstrated that they can be trusted, that they can get things done, and they're a collaborator. Some group comes together and tends to be the nexus for those kind of activities.
Yeah. If I understood the question that just came in, someone wanted to know is, when you were looking at our market and looking at the data, was there anything that really jumped out at you that said, ooh, gee, not so good, something that or it's something that they really need to ratchet up or do better at?
I think the two things that hopped out first were the loss of tech jobs and the slowing down, the negative slow growth of your GDP per capita. So those kind of things worry me for long term if I were assessing your region. On the other side, your manufacturing growth I thought was good. I think if you dug a little deeper and looked at your area, and as you know, we just did a cursory look. Dug a little deeper, you would look at the types of manufacturing that were growing or shrinking, and whether or not those were long term. And the ones that are growing, are they durable good, high wage, or are they non-durable good? And then the other thing I didn't present today, but when we looked at it, we always look at this. We looked at your occupational growth projections, and you have a lot of growth numbers projected over the next 10 years in occupations that play pretty low wages. And, you're not the most expensive place in the world, but certainly in the core of the region, your housing is not cheap, and a lot of the jobs are not paying wages that would allow you to be there. So if I did a housing analysis for you, I would probably find that some number, 20, 30, 40% of the jobs within the core of the region are underpriced to allow someone to live in the core of the region. And so that puts a lot of pressure on your transportation. It also puts a lot of pressure on you to be more collaborative regionally in having a regional housing market in your approach, and that's both single and multifamily. So that number of jobs that were paying, under $35,000 a year for full-time work was pretty high. But again, small sample of things we looked at, but those were the things that hopped out.
Ted, we could talk with you for the rest of the afternoon. You're very insightful. You have a lot of really good ideas about what's going on, what works, what doesn't, and how communities, you got a lot of knowledge on how communities are becoming much more regional in nature and growing significantly, growing the economy, but it's through collaboration. Thank you very much for your participation in this. You're going to have our minds here spinning for quite some time as we kind of dig down into the numbers some more and the information that you provided us. So thank you very much, Ted.
Thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure to be in Kentucky. I wish that I was there physically today, so I hope you'll invite me back when I can be on the ground there. Appreciate it a lot.
I'm sure that's going to happen. Thank you, Ted. And I want to thank all the attendees for participating today. The first ever regional summit that we pulled together. And I especially want to thank a number of folks, but Larry Jones with Community Trust Bank, who's our presenting sponsor, our other sponsors that you're going to start to hear from and see as you go forward. I want to thank them, and also all the participants, the attendees. Thank you very much for your time. I think this may be one of the most significant steps we've taken in a long time to really go together, to pull a region together in ways that helps all of us to grow our economy and to figure out ways in which we can work more closely together.